Welcome to The Conquering Truth. I'm Dan Horn.
I'm Jonathan Sides.
I'm Charles Churchill.
And I'm Joshua Horn.
And tonight we want to talk about space exploration. So recently, NASA landed a rover on Mars, Perseverance. We hear from Elon Musk. We hear from all kinds of different people that are trying to go up into space and creating, SpaceX and all these other things to try to explore space. And tonight we just wanted to talk about how should we think about this from a Christian perspective. So how should we think about this from a Christian perspective?
If you've watched any of our other podcasts to this point, you'll know that our standard answer to that is, well, what does the Bible say? But really, we can put some teeth to that, give some substance to that. Whenever you look at any human endeavor, especially something as big science, especially something that's just as massive of an undertaking, of a cooperative undertaking as space exploration, you have to say, where in Scripture can I ground this kind of an endeavor?
No pun intended.
No, it was not. Thank you. So, when you say, what are Christians supposed to do? What are humans supposed to do with something like this, with exploration? You probably ought to go back to the very first commands God gave to mankind and start with the dominion mandate. What did God tell man to do from the very beginning before you get into all the details?
Probably read the dominion mandate, Genesis 1:28. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." And so one thing that's not there is dominion over not the earth. All those things are pretty earthbound.
And one thing that when we read that, right, in terms of having dominion, having authority, it's really over the living things, right? It's over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air. And so even when we think about other things, there is subduing the earth, but it's not having dominion over it. It is really the idea of subduing it is to make it profitable, kind of would be a short form of that. What we're supposed to be doing is taking control of the earth so that it becomes useful. And so when we think about that, like you said, that's all earthbound. But even when we think about it, there's a real focus that's supposed to be on the living things and not the dead. Or not the non-living.
And we should probably frame what we even mean by space exploration, because putting satellites in orbit is very different from saying we're going to go to Mars, or we're going to go to the moon, and much different than saying we're going to build a sustainable colony on a remote planet. Those are very, very different things. Saying that you want to be able to see from space and be able to look at things from space, that is still something that its focus is on Earth very much. And you could make very real arguments about that still being part of dominion, whereas it's a lot harder to make the argument that going to Mars has anything to do with taking dominion of the Earth.
I want to push back a little bit on your comment about it's just over the living things, because even in that verse, there's non-living things that are mentioned there. You're supposed to fill the earth. There is a sense in which you're supposed to be able to look at the living things as your subjects, but it's not the only thing out there that God's created that you're supposed to look at and say, oh, this thing can be manipulated. This thing should be manipulated. We're supposed to look at the rocks and say, how can I make these rocks more profitable?
Right.
So I think one thing here is, that'd be worth touching on at least briefly is what is Earth? Because, there are, it's not an English, the scriptures weren't written in English, so what does the word earth mean? And there are words that are for the whole universe. But I think when I looked at this, I don't recall what the Hebrew word was, but I think it even means like land, the word for earth. Now we can kind of, broaden that a bit, because it even is referencing things in the ocean. But it's not one of these words that is interpreted to encompass the entire universe.
Certainly not cosmos. Yeah.
Right.
And obviously, since we're supposed to take dominion of the birds of the air, that dominion extends into what the Bible calls the first heaven, right? There's the first heaven, which is the atmosphere, and there's the second heaven, which we'd call, outer space, and then there's the third heaven where God dwells. But as you read Psalm 115:16, it does say that even the heavens are the Lord's, but the earth He has given to the children of men. And so even as we think about it, even with satellites, we should ask ourselves the question.
Right.
You can send up a satellite into space that is used to make Google Maps work, for instance. But we should also ask ourselves the question, should we? Or is that's outside of the atmosphere, so it's God's territory and not ours.
Right.
Which I think one thing here is when we remember Earth not as the plant but as land. So we're given the Earth to live on, which excludes the ocean. You know, people, science fiction writers and whatever, come up with ideas of whole cities in the water, which is, you know, which doesn't happen. I mean, other than ships, which are primarily used to get from one place to another. So the idea that we live in the water is not, we can't breathe the water, so we can't live in the water. And I think I've heard a comparison made between looking at the water, seeing what God has done in the water, using things from the water, and I think some people draw a comparison with that with space. We're not supposed to be living in the water, not supposed to be living in space, but doesn't mean you're completely forbidden from them. Because you see that we have dominion over the fish, we have dominion over the birds. So we are earth-bound creatures, but doesn't mean we don't interact with the water and with the air above us.
So clearly we're to have dominion over the birds of the air, so that means some interaction. But how should we think about it? How should we think about a satellite? Is that encroaching on God's territory? Because that's in the second heaven, if you will. And even there's borderline, because where is that line? And maybe, right. I think my answer...
Geosynchronous orbit, is that, you know what I mean, is that where the line is, or is it right? I mean, it's...
Right, I don't think there is a clear boundary. So right. I would probably even argue that it's probably acceptable as long as it's earth-bound in the sense, which a geosynchronous orbit is earth-bound. It's right. Earth that's driving it. You go further than that and it won't stay.
You haven't escaped the gravitational pull of the Earth, in a sense.
Right.
Yeah, and even...
But that's somewhat arbitrary.
Yeah, and even, I mean, there's no line between where... There's no clear line. I mean, it's just made up as a certain percentage of volume of how much is oxygen. I mean, there's bits of the Earth's atmosphere way out there. I mean, not all the way to the sun or anything like that, but a long way out there. There's stuff that is, you know, oxygen, nitrogen, stuff from the Earth's atmosphere. There's no clear line of you've now left the first heaven.
So if we move on from satellites, earthbound satellites, so how should we think about things beyond there? I think all of us would probably agree that man should be careful about where he goes and what he does, because we've only been given a certain authority and a certain responsibility.
I think if you start to look at some of the things that people are talking about when they're looking at space travel, we can start to see pretty easily like what off-limit things there are, and the goals that people are pushing for in a lot of the space programs are not goals that are biblical. And that kind of puts one bound on here's what you're not supposed to be doing. Like you have, you know, Elon Musk saying 1 million humans could live on Mars by the 2060s. Well, that is not going to happen for numerous reasons. But that goal is something that is not what the Bible is saying. The Bible is saying we have the earth to live on. And God put the heavens there, but we're supposed to be living on the earth. We're not supposed to be moving 1 billion people to Mars, even if such a thing were possible.
It certainly seems to me that a big part of this does go back to pride, right? I mean, why is Elon Musk saying that? Why does Palmer want to do something? Why does Branson want to do something? Why does Bezos? I mean, they're all trying to do space exploration, all these tech billionaires, if you will. Not all of them, but a lot of them really desire to do things in space. And a lot of it is competing with each other. That they're going, you know, hey, we do this and we get to be the biggest name. We get to be above everybody else. And so space exploration has always been about pride.
I mean, you don't even just get to be the biggest name. If you listen to what they say, you get to be the person that saved the human race. You know what I mean? I mean, you look at the quotes from them. I mean, it's, you know, there's going to be an extinction event. If we don't leave the earth, we're all going to die here. And that's their view. I mean, and so it's from their point, it's really funny in a sense, because in one sense, we're not supposed to use the resources of Earth. You know, I mean, you see this argument, you shouldn't use the resources of the Earth. The resources of the Earth belong to the Earth. But if you're going to use all the resources of the Earth to go to another planet, that's fine. You know, it's you know what I mean? I mean, and I don't think anybody even has a sense of how much of the resources of Earth it would take to set up a sustainable colony on a planet as far away as Mars.
I would like to see someone do a calculation of how much rocket fuel would it take to take 1 million people to Mars.
Right.
I haven't seen the number, but I'm guessing the number would say it is not going to happen.
Right. The amount of rocket fuel, the amount of food, the amount of things to produce oxygen, to produce sustainable water. It would be a lot more feasible to say, let's build a city in the ocean.
far
You know,
far
I
more
mean,
feasible.
far more
incredibly
feasible.
more feasible. You know, I mean, and feasible. I mean, it would be much more feasible to try to build a city in the ocean. That would be so much simpler. Require a tiny percentage of the resources, but you know, that wouldn't satisfy their belief. Which, I mean, their idea that the Earth is that we're gonna kill ourselves goes against the Word of God.
And you kind of see the lunacy that people that seem very smart end up getting to when they do not believe what God says.
Right.
You get people saying that you're going to ship everyone to Mars because you destroyed the Earth. Mars, which is a complete desert where you cannot even breathe,
Right.
where it has like nothing. I mean, no
Right.
other planet has anything that we can.
We have trouble getting along here on a planet where we have tons of resources, where we were designed to live in, and where it's pretty easy for us to get along. I think we'll do better whenever we're somewhere where we would have to, you know, be at each other's throats to survive. That's going to make us get along. I mean, it's a nonsensical proposition.
And the Bible says in the furrow of the poor there is much food, right? The earth was made to be productive. The problem that it's not productive is because of the sin of man. But the earth was made by God to be productive. That's not true for Mars. Mars wasn't made to sustain man. That was not its purpose. That's not what it was created for. It was created for the glory of God. And when we think all of a sudden that we can make it productive and take the earth, which is productive, and we say, oh, we're going to make it unproductive, but then we can make Mars productive, I mean, it's very irrational.
And the idea that you could even get Earth so bad that it wouldn't be easier to clean up Earth than to create something on Mars. I mean, like the Earth is in the perfect spot for there to be life, for there to be water, for there to be like a season, winter, summer. I mean, it's so fine that the distinction between the tilt of the Earth makes it very cold versus very hot. And yet we're going to go to Mars, you know, many, many miles out there, and now it's going to be livable when the reason we can live here is because we're in exactly this spot.
In a sense, humanity is basically, I mean, culturally, if we profess this desire, we're basically doing what all 20-year-olds have done at some point whenever they get to it, where things have gotten difficult, they've made a mess of certain things, and they go, I just want to go somewhere and start over from scratch where nobody knows who I am. That'll be so much easier than staying here and actually fixing myself. I mean, it's a civilization-wide desire to start over from scratch, and everybody looks at them and goes, when you get there, you'll still be you, and you still have to fix yourself. I mean, and this is Christianity's answer to man is you need God, you need Jesus Christ, because sin is the problem. Sin is at the door. And, I mean, I think one of the things we're going to talk about really quickly is this isn't a brand new thing. I mean, right after the fall, as man gets together, man had a very similar goal very early in civilization to reach for the stars. I mean, this isn't like some brand new idea.
Right, and obviously referring to the Tower of Babel. And the idea, you know, it says in Genesis 11:4, and they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered over the face of the whole earth. And when we think of space exploration, you know, what do Russia, China, the European nations, the U.S., where do we all work together? Where are all the nations working together? There's really only one place. It's like the International Space Station and the international plans for exploration of the solar system. I mean, this is where these nations get together.
Right.
That and the Olympics. And the Olympics is also about how great man is.
Right.
But you go back to the first space achievements is the space race. I mean, that is how much more can you get about making a name for yourselves than the space race? I mean, that.
And it's really interesting because the space race, right? It was, you know, the Soviet Union sent up a rocket up into space. And so the U.S. panicked because they're going, oh, the Soviet Union is going to get all these things about pride. So we have to, you know, gen up our pride. So we have to say we'll be by the moon by the end of the 60s. And it started out as pride, but it's interesting that it's no longer the pride of individual nations like it was in the 60s. Now it's shifted so that it's almost the pride of man joined together. It's kind of a reverse of the Tower of Babel, not in a righteous way, but in a way of building up more pride.
And just, I mean, the Tower of Babel, you remember, this is the story that happens right after the Great Flood. This is the next thing after the life of Noah. And they're trying to build a tower up to the heavens. You realize what they're doing is God said, I'm never going to destroy the earth with a worldwide flood again.
Right.
And they didn't believe him. The Tower of Babel was built as a response to fear that God was going to do what he had said that he wouldn't do again. Where he said that he was going to, that he would not destroy the earth by a worldwide flood again. And yet what they did was they decided that they would build this structure that would reach above the level of the waters in order to try and protect them, in order to give them somewhere that they could go. And, the text that follows the verses that are after this, it's kind of funny because God says, let us go down and see what they're doing. They weren't reaching the heavens. Right. Not that God can't see from where he is all things, but the text just has that little jab in there. Let's go down and see what they're up to.
See this super tall tower that they've built.
And God judged them for it. And God scattered them. And he made it such that doing these cooperative projects was hard.
I think I'd like to read the passage where God's promise is. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And the Lord smelled a soothing aroma. Then the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground for man's sake, although the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, nor will I again destroy every living thing as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, and day and night shall not cease. And so when you see Elon Musk's statement about the extinction event, God said no.
When you think of that, that applies to a lot more than space exploration, right? I mean, that's climate change.
Right.
One of the reasons that they say we have to be able to move to Mars is because the climate of the world might increase by 2 or 3 degrees.
Right.
Think about how silly that is. So you'll go to Mars with a climate that's unbelievably harsh.
Right.
So that it's different than any place in the world. It's much, much, much worse. But yet we go, because we're going to raise the degrees by 2, that therefore we're just all going to die.
We should just go somewhere where it's horrible and live there.
Right. I mean, it's very irrational. And it really is. It's what pride usually looks like. I mean, I think you use the example of a 20-year-old boy. This is why it looks so foolish.
Right.
And this is exactly what the space exploration looks like in so many ways.
But there's a way, I mean, I agree with you. It's irrational. It looks irrational. It's foolish. But there's a way that you can say that this is the rational outcome of a particular kind of worldview. Sure. And that's worth talking about here, because that's the reason that we're getting here is we've all been having this conversation from a Christian worldview where we say, well, what does the Bible say about something? And we ask what people would think are crazy questions like, well, are satellites legitimate? I don't know. We should look at the Bible and see what it says. I mean, people think it would just be crazy that you would say, something that would help with Google Maps isn't actually useful and legitimate and appropriate.
Right.
But if you start with a different worldview than that, if you're not starting with the Bible, if you're starting with an evolutionary worldview, you've got things built up in that mythology that all lead to this. That mythology is built up on the scarcity of resources. It's built up on competition for resources. The key element of that is finding new spaces in which you could use different sets of resources. It's all about extinction events.
Right. And
that's how you think that the world has run since the world started running. And so your expectation is that, well, it's going to happen, and it's going to happen now. And because you don't believe God and you don't believe what God has said, you've got this other naturalistic paradigm. And this is the logical conclusion of an evolutionary worldview, is to say, well, things on Earth have always gotten bad. The dinosaurs died out. We've gone through ice ages, so we've gone through hot spells, and now we're just going to go through another one, and this one's of our own doing, so let's see what we can do to save whatever bit of humanity we can save.
And it sort of is, but there is this part of it where I think they know, like Dan was talking about, Mars isn't more hospitable than their worst doomsday scenario for Earth. You know what I mean?
I'd much rather live on the Earth during an ice age,
and they
than on
know
Mars.
that. And I mean, like, I agree with you in the sense of logic does not prevent you. If you have bad assumptions, logic will not prevent you from reaching ridiculous conclusions. Sure. But there is even this part of it where even within their own arguments, the solution it doesn't satisfy their conditions, but they still want to do it. And it hasn't worked for anybody else. But you know what? It just might work for us.
Well, it seems to me that there is another aspect to it too, right? Because it does come back to pride. Because what they're saying is these evolutionary forces that have been forcing everything for the last, whatever they're up to now, 16.7 billion years or whatever they say the universe is, that these evolutionary forces have been causing things to happen. But we are better than that. We can change everything. And so a lot of it is just raw pride that they, even with their evolutionary worldview, they say that extinction event can't affect us because I'm Jeff Bezos. I'm
right. Their
Elon
expectation
Musk.
should be that using their resources to go and try to settle on another planet is actually the extinction event. You know what I mean? That should actually be their expectation based on what they've said about the way that the world works. Is
and some of Elon Musk, he does say, I hope to live on Mars, but I hope to die on Mars. I just hope it's not on the landing. He says something about that.
Right.
And so, I mean, they even recognize the difficulty, but I think their pride is such that they're going, it's impossible. We can do the impossible.
I think if we just loop back to the Tower of Babel for a second, you have their goal was to reach the stars. Then you go to the 20th century, feel like we've achieved the Tower of Babel, stuff that was unthinkable to people at that time. And then, we take our telescope and point it into the, darkest corner of the sky, and then we develop a picture, and we realize that there is so much more stars that we have a pantheon of stars in this little picture, each of which is a galaxy with who knows how many stars in it. And so when we think that we have done this amazing thing, when we really get from it is realizing how small we are compared to the vastness that God has made, and that our thinking that we have tamed the space to our will, as foolish as that thought may be, it's even in the process of doing that is revealed how much greater it is than we even understood.
And it's interesting because man's response to that isn't to go, look how magnificent this is, look how unbelievable it is that creation is so vast. The answer usually is, well, if creation's that vast with evolution, that means there's more cases for the chance. So there must be more Earth-like planets where there's other people on, where there's other races, there's other life, and that we should be able to find that life. So their response is not because, carnal man can't see and understand spiritual things. He looks at it and he doesn't go, this shows there's a God. He looks at it and goes, there must be other people. And it's that's very much the response to seeing those pictures, is that means that there's more universes, there's more galaxies, they're doing everything to try to prop up the theory of evolution. And that just means that proves it. We should be able to find, some radio wave from someplace that shows that, yes, there's life out there. There's intelligence out there.
There's a couple of things going. Obviously, they are trying to support the idea that the theory of evolution works, and the argument is pretty simple. It's, evolution. The argument that they're trying to address is that, hey, mathematically, the fact that evolution happened here on Earth is really small. And even the evolutionists admit this. This is not a creationist bent here. It's just mathematically, to get life from non-life is very, 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 very unlikely, approaching zero.
Right.
And so if it happened here and somewhere else, maybe there's other factors out there that we don't know about that give us more warrant for believing in this theory of evolution.
Right.
So that's part of it. But I keep going back to the mythology of it all and the storytelling that it evokes. And it's part of what's going is you already are committed to an evolutionary worldview, but you are a created being of God. Whether you don't want to admit that, but you are a created being of God. And because of that, you've got these tensions that you're dealing with. You're trying to rebel against God. And yet at the same time, you realize, hey, I don't want to be alone in the world. That the bedrock, a purely naturalistic story, is not really satisfying. So what can we do? Well, let's bring in life from the stars. We won't believe in God. We won't believe in angels and demons, but we will believe in little green men. Or for if we want to be more sophisticated, we'll believe that if we can find water, then maybe there's life there too.
Right.
And this is not, this idea that this obsession with space is a religion isn't some, Christian thing that we've come up with. I mean, this is what they say. I mean, in researching a little bit before this podcast, I came across an interesting article in The Atlantic called "The Holy Cosmos, a New Religion of Space Exploration." Let me read this quote. "When viewed as a whole, space exploration has a lot in common with religion. It offers us a salvation narrative, for instance, whereby we put our faith in technology in order to be delivered to new worlds. Its priests, figures like Neil deGrasse Tyson, extol its virtues in what sound like sermons. In its iconography, astronauts are like saints that ascend into heaven, and extraterrestrials are like gods, benevolent, kind, wise, capable of manipulating space and time." And this article is not critical of this idea that space exploration is a religion. It's pro this. It's saying, in this secular world, here's our new religion. It's a religion of science, so-called, and we're part of the space cult.
And it seems to me that, a lot of what drives the space exploration is to prove that their religion is true, right? The reason that the Perseverance is landed where it did on Mars is that they thought from, the imagery that they had before that it looked like there might be an ancient river there. And so you land where the ancient river is because then you can dig into the rocks and maybe you can find some kind of amino acids or something that prove that there was life as we know life. Because obviously without water there can't be life. They know there's no water there, but that still means they want to go dig holes where there could have been water. What really drives it is looking for life. And the other thing that really drives it, like the Hubble Space Telescope and expecting to send up the Webb Space Telescope in October, is what it's scheduled for. And the main reason they're sending it up is because they think that they can get radio waves that will prove the Big Bang Theory. This is about proving their religion. They recognize that even after they've taught it in school for decades, even after for a century and a half, even though they've been pushing it, a lot of people go, that's nonsense. It just doesn't make sense.
The Big Bang Theory, it's kind of become
everything comes from nothing.
It's starting to wobble, and it's starting to wobble more, and
so send up a telescope, and then you can look and you can show that the radio waves are what you're predicting, and that's what they're doing. What they're doing is they're spending the public dollars to try to prove their theology, even though their theology has all kinds of problems in it. But like you said, it's wobbling, but the best way to stabilize the idol is to get new evidence.
Right.
Or evidence at least that you can spin. One of the things that they're doing is they're going and, like I said, they're landing in this ancient riverbed, is what they hope it is, to try to find life. But one of the big problems they have is, what is life? Because their theology doesn't give a definition of life. So how will they know that they find it when they find life?
I would say the argument that it's not so much an argument, but the position that they would take is you don't actually have to find something that you would clearly define as life. All you have to do is you have to find something that would be on the spectrum of making life possible. And we know that that's the way it would work because that's the argument that the evolutionists use for getting life from non-life. It's like, okay, well, Darwin had this idea of all he needs a warm little pond somewhere, and that would be life. And so people go out and they try experiments where they zap little petri dishes and start collecting the amino acids that they create and say, aha, well, look, we can use completely non-biological materials and processes and get biological products. Therefore, evolution is possible. That's the way the argument would work.
But they haven't advanced from that since I forget when that was done, like late 60s
but
or something.
But if that's what you think is sufficient to prop up your mythology, then all you have to do is just find that same process happening somewhere else.
And we've already seen it over and over again. The first one, I think, was where they were saying that there were, you look at the moon and the pictures of the moon, and you can see, canals that have been dug by moon men. And then you have, we found evidence of riverbeds. We found evidence of ice caps. And all of these are given as proof of life. Because when you have this theory that you've based your whole worldview on, any scrap of evidence, you'll seize on it and say it's now proved. So I think whatever they find, it's going to be very. The theory is not going to be disproved, because even if there was no life in our solar system, according to the mathematics that they put out there probably shouldn't be. There shouldn't be life anywhere you have to look through the whole universe according to their numbers to find life. So the idea that there would be life on Earth and life on Mars that didn't come from Earth, I mean, that it would just be so astronomically rare that it shouldn't happen anyway. So even if they searched every planet in the solar system and determined there was no life on them and never had been, well, that doesn't disprove the theory, because that's what they were expecting anyway.
Right. There's a pretty tight. There's an intersection between the heart of man and, the thinking of a grant writer. At the end of every grant, you say, "This warrants further investigation." I mean, and in a sense, I mean, it's what Jonathan's saying, it's what Joshua's saying, it's what you were saying. I mean, Romans 1 says, God has made himself known to man. And so whenever there are times where man is threatened by coming to face with the fact that there is a God, and in that moment, man is ready to pivot and find anything else that he can grab onto and run and chase so that he can suppress the truth and unrighteousness. And so, I mean, your question is, what is life? And I mean, yeah, their whole goal is to not find life, because God is life.
And even in another sense, their goal is kind of not to find life, because if they found it, they might stop getting grants, because a lot of this is about money.
Right. I mean,
we shouldn't deny it. And, looking out there at what space exploration, most of them kind of have given up on the idea of finding life. What they really want to do is find water, because they'll associate water with life.
Right.
But water's not life. And the problem even with associating water and saying water, if there's water there, it means there's life there, it also very much restricts the kind of life that is life. I mean, they're saying that if it's not like them, it's not life when they're searching for water, because obviously humans are very water-based.
Right.
So they're even taking a worldview that says that everything has to be water-based to be life. In different scientific fields, they don't. Like when they're doing radio waves and stuff, they're just like trying to find some pattern that would indicate to them that there was some intelligence that was transmitting information on it, right? And so they're not looking for water. But the exploration in this solar system has almost always been focused on water.
Right.
And how can you get beyond what God made? I mean, when someone comes out with a movie with an alien in it, I mean, it's not. It is basically, it has to be a person, an animal with something attached to it in a slightly different shape. I mean, you can't come up with a new concept of a living being, because God put us in a world where living beings are in a certain way.
Except that there are living beings that aren't like that, right?
Well,
which we talked about before, like angels and demons. I mean, they're real. There is life out there.
Visible beings.
No, I understand that. I'm just saying there is life out there.
They ate with Abraham.
So they're right. There's life. There's
there is life out there that was created by God. When we think about looking for life, they won't find the life that's out there. Not that angels and demons would actually reveal themselves to them. I'm not saying that.
Or would satisfy them.
Or would satisfy them. But as Christians, there is life beyond this solar system. It's not the life that God created for this planet, though. Part
of it is, when you look at what is life, one of the things, Paul's answered on Mars Hill, reading, one of your poets has written, "In him we live and move and have our being. God is life." God, and you read the confession, he is the source of all life. All subsistence is found in him. And it's a really interesting thing, because man wants to look anywhere else for life. Man wants to look everywhere else to find it. And it's something that the church wrestles with. Everything from fad diets to, views on how to be happy, how to be fulfilled. On your children and psychology. This isn't something that you can look at and say the world struggle. Man struggles with this because man doesn't want to acknowledge God as who he is, and God is the source of all life. We do know that there won't be life that are men, right? Because when Paul's speaking at Mars Hill in Acts 17:26, he says, "And he made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings." God appointed the boundaries of their dwellings, and it is earth. And we shouldn't think it's anything else. And the other thing is, in Deuteronomy 32, in the Song of Moses, Moses even says that the way he set the boundaries after the Tower of Babel was related to the children of Israel. And that doesn't mean that the physical children of Israel, that doesn't make any sense there. That means the spiritual children of Israel, all those who will be saved, the invisible church, if you will. And the only people that will be saved are people that are on earth.
And so think about how miserable it is if you think, oh, let's create a new nation on Mars. Understand, you're separate from God's will. Because he says that the children of Israel are on this earth.
And you're not saying that if they did do a thing on Mars, that no one on Mars could come to know God or could be saved there. You're not saying that someone there couldn't hear the word of God and come to know who he is.
But I think they would return to Earth.
Right. That's what I'm saying is there's just part of it where you go, right. And
that's part of my point is that it would be really something to repent of. Because God said our habitations are going to be on Earth. Now, my personal opinion is it's incredibly far-fetched, the idea of anybody living on another planet for any length of time. Living on the moon for a few days, that's happened, and you can understand that. But Mars is a whole different thing, and anything sustainable. Nobody's ever thought that there was any way to have anything sustainable that actually is credibly thought it out about how do you move that mass of materials, how do you move the people, how do you get anything off. It's a big planet. How do you get anything off once you're there?
Right. The order of problem solving is on a whole other, is dramatically different.
As different as the size of Mars and the moon, and the different, multiplied by the difference in distance. I mean, that just creates a whole different set of problems.
I mean, we've spent a lot of money. We've spent a lot of money right now just doing things like going to the moon, just doing things like putting the International Space Station in orbit and keeping it in orbit and doing maintenance runs. I mean, the amount of money that we've spent on that isn't trivial at all. And so, and like I said, the cost of doing something beyond that, it's not going to be double. It's not going to be triple. It's going to be thousands of times greater.
So today I was looking around to see how much money we've spent in the U.S. just doing space exploration. And you look at it, and I think the max was in all this is in 2020 dollars, but I think the max was like $45 billion. And considering what the budget is in the U.S., that doesn't sound like much. But if you look at the percentage of the budget, which is on the next one, at one point it was 5% of the U.S. budget. Think about that. Right? We've talked about this podcast before. God has given certain responsibilities to government. It is not to go to the moon, but it's to defense, to suppress evil, and we're spending 1/20th of the national budget going to the moon. And we should just recognize that that's huge in the sense that what happened when we decided to do that was we restructured what government was supposed to do in a real way. I don't think you get Johnson's Great Society program without the moon program coming at the beginning, because what they said about the moon program was there is no way that individual enterprise could ever do this. It's just not possible. So we can show that the government can do things that men can never do. And so that was the argument Kennedy was making, is that this can only be done by government. And that's the argument that Johnson made when he said, we're going to wipe out poverty. It's too big for any individual. It's too big for churches to deal with. It's too big for charities to deal with. The government has to do it. It's the only one that can take on such large projects. And it really does start with there's Social Security and stuff that was coming before, but it takes a real jump in budget and in direction of the country after the moon. And a lot of it comes down to we succeeded, and it puffed up our pride. And so then we said we can wipe out poverty.
But the idea that the government is the only one who could do space travel has been more recent years been pretty thoroughly disproven when the U.S. government has no vehicles to get to the moon right now and hasn't for some time. I mean, the U.S. government hires private companies to go to the moon. Like before we were trashing Elon Musk, give him credit. I mean, he is even starting businesses that are using not just government funding, because of course, as a government contractor, it still ends up being government funding. But you have where now the U.S. government doesn't have vehicles going to space. They've turned back to private industry, and the private industry is even going to space to start its own businesses and not just to do government projects.
In some of them, it's dramatic in the reduction of cost of satellites, because it used to be that NASA put up most satellites, and their price dropped dramatically when private industry got in. So it was a false argument from the beginning, but it was an argument that Americans bought.
I think if we had a space program that was 1% or even 5% of the U.S. government budget, but if someone's writing the budget that actually was paying attention to or cared about limited government, that would be a whole different story. When maybe the current budget for NASA is the U.S. government's budget or something along those lines, I mean, then 1% is a lot different.
Right, and obviously you see the percentage of the budget. The budget was fairly flat after the 60s, but yet you see the percentage goes down and down and down because the government goes bigger and bigger and bigger.
And one question is, those billions that we've been spending in recent years, when we have no vehicle to even take us to space, what is that money going towards? I mean, there's the space station. This might be getting a bit into the weeds, but I've read articles saying the space station is a big waste of time and money and very inefficient. Why are we even having a space station? Even accepting their goals for, space travel.
Right.
But,
These are critics within who
right.
fully
These are
support
pro-space
space.
people.
Right, and they're still
and
questioning
they're saying
the
this is
efficacy.
a big waste of money.
And I do think that you look at these tech billionaires and they are looking and they're seeing a business opportunity. I mean, part of it is I'm going to be the first people that colonize Mars, but they're also going, there's money to be made here because it has been incredibly inefficient. And so one thing that the space program should have taught that it did not was it should have taught governments are lousy at doing projects like this, not good, because the cost-benefit ratio is not there. And I mean, one of the things, though, that people talk about all the time is, but look at all the benefits from space travel or the space exploration. I mean, there haven't been that many. There's been a lot of talk about them. And some of the things people ignore the trends that were already happening. Like integrated circuits tends to be the big one that they say. Computers wouldn't be like they are now except for the space program. But the reality is they were invented before the space program started.
Right.
There was a couple years there that they were buying almost 100% of boards that were produced. But that rapidly changed.
Right.
And while they may have come, maybe computers would be 2 years behind where they are now if they hadn't done that.
Right.
But it was not things that industry wasn't already doing. So a lot of times they take credit for things saying, look at what we did. This is an offshoot of all this billions of dollars we spent. We got this. Where the reality is that those are things that if you were trying to design a faster computer, you wouldn't design a faster computer that would fit in a box that would go on a spacecraft. And so that design is not perfect for the design of just getting something faster and more usable and more efficient. And so we take these secondary crumbs and we go, but look at all the benefits of space exploration. But if you go to NASA's website, I mean, they very much talk about, look at all the benefits of space travel. And they talk about technological benefits. And it's very, very much spun by marketeers. And people need to understand that about the space program. And it is done by marketeers that are trying to, like you said before, the end of every grant is we need to continue to research this. Right. And so a lot of things they're saying is you need to keep putting money into this because look at all these benefits. And people don't go, would we have these anyway? Right. And the answer is almost certainly yes.
I think it does go back to the Dominion mandate because there's a part of it where work is how things should be developed. And when you develop things this is sort of a thing that as a father you can see this in your home, you can see it in business if you run a business. There are times where people develop interesting things when they're not doing the work that they're supposed to be doing, but the things that are the most useful for your company are the things that they develop when they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. And when you're developing things that aren't tied to the work you're supposed to be doing, it's called a distraction. I mean, and that's really what it is. And so there's this part of it where humanity gets distracted from the work they're supposed to be doing instead of focusing on the work that God's called us to do. And so we develop these things and we start chasing these things. And we're children. You send your kids out in the backyard to work on the garden. And you come home and they started, they ran into this thing and they started doing something else. And you find they've spent the entire day doing something entirely different than what you want them to do. The garden hasn't moved 1 foot forward, but they're all excited about all these other things that they've done and they've built and they've played with and they've basically played games all day. And you see this at companies where people basically have been playing instead of actually moving the thing forward. And so there's this part of it where you look at what's happened with even the internet. And you look at the way we built the internet has been geared towards entertainment for a good while. There is real work that happens on it, but a huge amount of the internet has been geared towards entertainment because man is distracted by it. We're pursuing our own interest in it instead of actually doing the work that God has called us to do. And so the dominion mandate's really useful. It focuses us on what God's called us to do as opposed to what we want to get distracted by.
I mean, one of the things that is interesting to me is when you look at how the space program tries to say, this is why we should continue it. It's interesting how much they appeal to the dominion mandate. Teflon, computers, right? They list all these things that came from the space program. And all those things, in the end, are about subduing the earth and taking dominion of the birds and the animals. And it's just very interesting to me that in the end, even the people who are doing space exploration, now if they prove their religion, I could believe that they would be making very vastly different statements. But they haven't had any traction in proving their religion at all. But without that, they end up basically going, we should do this because of the benefit to fulfill what man's here for. Because in the end, man knows that's more important to him than the space stuff. Because the reality is, it is more important that you can eat. It is more important, that you take dominion.
Right.
That these have real effects on people's lives that are a lot closer than going into outer space.
I do want to suggest that the dominion mandate doesn't exclude Christians from being interested in space travel or space exploration. Because I think if you read the dominion mandate too literally, you start to exclude things like music. Like, if you read it very literally, it doesn't say that you should be producing music for the glory of God. Now, not that you can't fit it into those categories with a little pushing and shoving, but read very strictly, it doesn't encompass that. And I think if we look at verses like Psalm 19:1, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Psalm 8:3-4, when I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you visit him? And I think when we look at verses like that, there is this concept of considering the heavens and considering God's creation that is inside what Christians are supposed to be doing. And I think you look at the space program and we can see there's a lot of bad motivations and bad goals and bad strategies. But I think there are a lot of, really incredible things that have come out of it that Christians can use to praise God. I mean, you look at 100 years ago, they didn't have a picture of the globe, of the earth, of the world God made. I mean, these are just things that they didn't have not that long ago. I mean, to see a picture from the moon of Earth, that is a pretty incredible thing. And it shows us things about God, things about the way he made the universe. And it shows how small we are. On Earth, looking at, other people in our cities, they can look really grand. Suddenly you zoom out and you look at Earth as just this tiny dot. There's other pictures where you see the sun as a dot and you can't even see the Earth because we're so small. And that spacecraft is flying out. It is so close to us relative to everything else in the universe. It is basically right on top of us, and yet you can't even see man. And I think there are valuable lessons that we can learn from these things. And I think it is a valuable avenue for us to explore and for us to do. And so I think, my kids, love reading about space. When I was younger, and even now I like reading about space. And I don't think that's a bad thing as long as we're doing it for the right reasons and as long as we're being biblical about our goals and reasonable about the amount of resources we're dedicating to it.
I do think that there's an aspect of that there's a big difference between that shot, which was taken by somebody that where there was a human involved, versus the shots that you're talking about where we sent a piece of metal out into space. Because one of the things that we have to also do is value life and go, how much do we need that picture and how many lives is it worth? Because we talked about financial costs, but there's cost of life too. And so I don't disagree with you at all that you can send a camera into space and get these pictures, and these pictures help you understand the glory of God. The Hubble telescope and maybe the next telescope will see things that do expand our view of how great God is. And that's a great blessing, like you said before, about that you see all the arrays of stars, that there were a lot that we had never detected before that we now see, and that we see the glory of God through that. But I do think that's different than sending men up too.
And that is no Christian exclusive concept either. I mean, there's very pro space exploration people that say we should not be sending people because it's dangerous and it's cheaper to send robots, and so why bother sending people? So that idea is not revolutionary at all.
And it would be a really nice thing. It would be a really, really good thing if someone was actually having a debate over, can we do this to better understand God and glorify God? I mean, if someone actually came and said, hey, we think we want to send this up so we can see the earth and we can see space and we can glorify God, and we think this is worth doing, and that was the nature of the discussion, and that was the nature and the point of doing it.
Well, welcome to the podcast.
I mean that if the
Right.
people who were actually doing this were having that discussion, that would be a really great thing.
Right.
I mean, when you talk about the Dominion Mandate and music and things like that, I mean, the Dominion Mandate isn't specifically about worship. It's not about how to worship God in specific. And so, I mean, I think that's interesting in the sense of it's giving the bounds of the work that God has given man to do. And I would argue that worship is one of the work that God has given man to do. But the Dominion Mandate is not where commands on specific worship is found. And so, and it's something where probably, there's probably another podcast in there talking about what is the place of art and things in life, and where do we go to understand those things. And maybe it's a podcast that someone else should do.
Also, some artists, perhaps.
But you know what I mean? It is a really interesting thing when you look at it. It was one of the first commands that God gave man, and it really does frame the work that man has been given to do. But like you said, there are specific things within there that it's not talking about at all, and it's interesting to look at what God did and why He did it that way.
Even when we talk about the Dominion Mandate, if you will, the first job that man had, the first job that Adam had, it was in a sense a poetic job. He was supposed to name the animals. So God says, you're supposed to fill the earth and subdue it. And task number one is you've got to classify things. But it's not just a raw drop them into buckets and bins. He's naming the animals, and whatever he named them, that's what they were called.
Adam had the spiritual gift of administration.
I mean, I think that's really interesting in helping us talk about this, because it's God who knows all the stars by name. The
Right.
Psalms tell us that.
Right.
God did not give the task of naming the stars to us, and we can call them whatever we like, but God knows their names.
Right.
But God did give us the task of naming the animals.
Right.
And so there's, but going back to what you're saying about art, and the first thing that man did, the first job he did was an artistic job.
Or job of creating order, in a sense. I mean, it's a really interesting...
Which is a kind of
Right.
artistry.
Right. It's an intersection of art and science, in a sense. I mean, in a way that people struggle with describing at times, but in the end, it's not that hard to describe when you say it the way you're saying it there.
Right.
And some of the taking dominion is you do use music and stuff. It's an interesting question, and I'm
Right.
just thinking that there's lots of, you think of snake charmers, obviously they're using, music to control, and
Look at the military.
and I was also thinking of Saul and David,
Right.
that there was a real control of Saul. Now that's not part of the Dominion Mandate either, but it is an interesting question.
And a big problem with modern art is that it disconnects the art from any purpose and any reality. Like, art is good for its own sake. So the fact that you're depicting something that you can't even understand doesn't matter. Instead of, in previous generations, art was supposed to be teaching you specific things. And so kind of completely disconnecting it from the Dominion Mandate ends up creating serious problems.
And I mean, just going back to, what were things like when God was giving this Dominion Mandate? He's giving it to a man who's in a garden. God made a garden, and that garden was in the midst of Eden, in the midst of wilderness. Everything outside that was wilderness. And the implication is, in his unfallen state, Adam was supposed to proceed out of the garden and turn the rest of the world into garden. He was supposed to, it's artistry, it's order. We don't have a lot of context, but what context we do have is that the work that Adam was supposed to do has this very heavy artistic element, what we would call an artistic element to it now.
And I don't think, in terms of, subduing the earth, that when we think of that subduing, and even if it's, profiting from it, I mean, we shouldn't ignore aesthetics. God doesn't.
Right.
So how can we say that's not profitable?
Right.
And one of the useful reasons, perhaps, for the space exploration, one of the reasons that we like it and our kids like it, is you get to see God's artistry. When you invent a little Tasco telescope and can see the features of the moon, and then when you send something way out there and can see things far beyond anything earthbound, and you see that you have no idea the extent of God just because of what he has created and decided to reveal, only because that there's this technology that we now have access to. And it's just, and you realize God created those things, and for thousands and thousands of years, he was the only person who experienced them. I mean, perhaps angels do. I don't know about that. But humans had no idea. God just created them just because. It was just an expression of him. And it's only in this present time that we get to see those kinds of things and have some sense of what God had kept secret. And if that's what he can keep secret, we have no idea what heaven's like.
And it always will be secret. I mean, at least as far as anyone can foresee. I mean, you look at the number of stars, the number of, planets around those stars that are so far away from anything that we can ever imagine going to. I mean, the level of, all those amazing creations that it is impossible for us to see more than a tiny dot on a picture. I mean, you see how much more there. Even once we start to see a little more of it, you see how much more there is that will never be seen.
Mm-hmm.
And some of these things, right? I mean, they used to say that the universe was finite. I mean, when I was taking physics, they always said that the universe is finite. Now they're saying it's infinite, and part of that is that they saw a lot more stars than they expected. And so they go, there must be more out there. And so that they had all these theories about size that have been, undermined because God's more glorious than what they can expect. Thank you for joining us. We do, hope that this conversation was profitable. We're supposed to be taking God's word and applying it to all areas of life, and it's very easy for us to assume things are acceptable without actually going to God's word. So we pray as we consider these things tonight that we've helped other people to also consider them. Thanks for joining us.
This has been The Conquering Truth, a project of Reformation Baptist Church. If you found this helpful, you can visit us online at theconqueringtruth.com and subscribe here or in your favorite podcast app. Thanks for watching.